Okay, let's talk cables. Let's make sure we have a distinction between polarity and phase. So polarity is the positive and negative relationship of a signal. So we have a median line and we determine whether the signal goes above or below the median first as it travels. And as we look at it in two-dimensional, we translate that to up and down across the median line. Now, speakers move in and out. Sound waves travel differently, but when we look at it in two-dimensional. So when we think about 180 degrees out of phase, we also call that reverse polarity. So what we have here is two signals which are the same phase, meaning the blue signal goes up and the red signal goes up, but there is a phase difference because one happens in time a little bit later. Over here, we have the blue and the red as reverse polarity or inverted polarity because our red signal goes up then down, whereas our blue goes down then up. So that is a polarity issue. And we know if we add those together, we will get no sound. The result of adding these two together will be comb filtering. Polarity also comes up in relation to physical hooking things up like speakers, because in this instance, red plugging into the red and black plugging into black will make sure the polarity stays the same. But if we were to invert these in the other speaker, we would have all sorts of phase issues because of the polarity issues.
In phase. In phase.
I have this old banana plug here because this is how archaic used to be. This little notch was how you knew which side was the black or the red, was that little notch. Resistance, right? So we think of resistance and impedance are related. So in relation to cable, if we have high resistance versus low resistance, or really what we say is high impedance or low impedance. High impedance means high resistance. And resistance comes in the form of efficiency. So if we have low resistance or low impedance microphones, we have more cable for the sound to travel through, we have better performance, and we'll have less conversion to heat. We think of our voltage, right? We have mic level. So we know that this is our weakest signal, somewhere way, way down there. So the transfer from what a mic preamp does is bring mic level up because this is such a very low signal. Next, we have instrument level. So now this varies because it depends on whether you're talking about bass with active pickups or passive pickups. Keyboards, DJ equipment, different things have instrument level can mean different things. So this is a pretty wide range, but it is above mic level, but is not quite next to line level. And we know what the mic preamp brings the mic level up to line level. And when we're dealing with that, we have the two different voltages that come with that. Consumer gear runs at negative 10 dBV. Pro gear runs at plus 4 dBV. And that also determines whether we're unbalanced or balanced when we're hooking up our line level signal. And our fourth voltage is the idea of our speaker or power. This happens after the amplification stage, not the pre-amplification stage from mic level to line level, but after the amplification stage. And now we're sending in massive amounts of voltage. That leads us to the three categories of cables. We have our balanced audio cable, our unbalanced audio cable, and our speaker or power cables. So let's break that down. Relation to impedance. We know that balanced is low impedance. Balanced means low resistance, whereas unbalanced is going to be high impedance. In relation to our speaker level, we'd like no impedance. We'd like to be able to put 100 watts down the line and have it not converted to heat, but we know that that's simply not possible. Unbalanced cables. So what we have are a single conductor. We have our hot or positive and our ground. So the signal is carried on the hot, and then our ground or earth or shield are trying to prevent noises from coming in. Looks something like this. So we have our core audio in the middle. That's carrying our actual signal, a little bit of insulation around that. And then there's a shield wrapped around that, and then an outer insulation to give it some kind of durability. We think of unbalanced cables, we tend to think of these two types of connectors. 1/4 inch or TS, tip sleeve cables, generally also called a 1/4 inch cable. And then we have our RCA. And you can see in this we have just two wires per RCA, meaning one's the hot and one's the shield. With unbalanced cable, we're usually thinking 20, 25 feet as far as our cable runs, a little bit less professional. And then we definitely know that guitars, amps, keyboards all get plugged in using unbalanced cables. So they get used quite a bit. And a standard guitar cable, unbalanced, 2 wires, 1 hot, 1 shield. We get to balanced cables. Now we have our plus, we have our minus, and then we have our ground or our shield. So we have our hot, our cold, and then our shield. Remember from 113, we talk about this. So we have our signal that's carried on both the hot and then the inverted signal carried on the negative. That travels down the wire. Noise comes on the wire, but the noise is going to be in phase with itself, and then we're going to flip it back. So the noise then will cancel itself out, and the signal will be flipped into phase, giving us clean output. So we can do much longer cable runs. Our 3 types of balanced cables are XLR or microphone cable. TRS stands for tip, ring, sleeve, and our TT, which stands for tiny telephone. You'll see those cables in Studio E Patch Bay. You'll notice it's balanced because it has the little notch right there, and that lets you know it's different than this, which does not have the notch. So what can we do with balanced cables? Well, we can run much longer cable runs. We're going to lose much less high frequency, and we will have less noise. We have a couple issues that we have with cables that we need to take into consideration with high impedance and low impedance. One is RFI, radio frequency interference. And cables are essentially antennas. So they're out there capturing radio frequency waves. So one of the things that we use the low impedance cables for is that when it inverts polarity, and it'll cancel that as radio, but it certainly can happen. And guitar players may have had that experience of hearing radio stations coming out of their amplifier. And if you've seen the scene in Spinal Tap, it's in there. We are usually close to magnets if we're close to speakers. Speakers have giant magnets in them, so we are dealing with electromagnetic induction, so that can also affect the noise that's coming into cables. If cables are stacked next to each other with really hot signals, these can jump from cable to cable. That is called crosstalk. It happens in mixers, happens in installations, and it's certainly something we need to take into consideration. But yes, signal running next to another cable, some of the signal can jump over and the voltage can be converted and picked up by the other cable, and that's called crosstalk. We can have something called a ground loop, which is if we have more than one ground and we can get a 60 cycle hum, and that's something that we want to avoid. A lot of DI boxes will have called a ground lift. So if there's something that's humming, we can flip that switch on the ground lift and take off the ground, and sometimes that will eliminate the noise. Now, you'll notice on a standard headphone cable for a stereo pair of headphones, it looks like we have that notch. So that looks like it's balanced. And it is, in fact, not. But what we're using with this technology is using the hot and cold to carry the left and right, and they're both sharing this shield. So in this diagram, you can see left is going to the left, right is going to the right. And then the shield is carried between those. So between the two conductors, they are using a common shield. So while a headphone cable or a connector looks balanced because it has that little notch, it is in fact carrying a stereo signal of 2 unbalanced signals. So in here, what is that notch? Well, you can see that's our isolating ring that separates the sleeve from the ring. So we have our tip, we have our ring, and our sleeve. And that little notch gives it away. You can see here without this, we know that this is now unbalanced quarter inch. This is a balanced quarter inch. So tip, ring, sleeve. So now we have this cable. Looks like a TRS type cable. It's an 1/8 inch to 2 RCA connectors. So is this balanced or unbalanced? It is unbalanced because it ends in RCA cables. So similar to the headphones, it's sharing an independent right and left and then sharing the ground. In lieu of cables, or if we need to convert one way to another, we can use something called a direct box or a DI box. Now what this does is convert unbalanced high impedance to balanced low impedance. So you can see we have an input jack and we have a through jack. So for instance, we might plug an acoustic guitar with a pickup. and we want to put it into our mixer. Well, that's a high impedance cable, and we might need to run it from the stage all the way to the back where the mixer is in the back of the live room. So we want to do that low impedance because we want to be able to run long cable runs and not lose the high end. So we plug in the input, and out the back of here would be the XLR cable, and that would then convert it to low impedance. So the box is doing some magic to convert it from unbalanced high impedance to low impedance balance. Notice it has a through, so we can continue on with that. So what would that look like? It would look like this, where we have the bass guitar plugging into the DI box, and the DI box then using the throughput to take the cable run right to the guitar amp, in this case the bass amp. So really this cable jumps over here and continues the signal. So we've added a little bit of cableage by running to the DI to the amp instead of running just plugging in the amp, but we're running that unbalanced instrument signal into the amplifier head, which is what that head expects. In this case, you can see then we have the XLR cable running out of there and plugging into our mixer, which then can go into our PA system. The two types of DI boxes that you might see are active and passive. And active requires some sort of power source, either a 9-volt battery or some sort of battery or 48 volts. A lot of them will run on. And it's going to do, you send a really robust powered signal down the line. So if you need to run really far, an active DI box is the way to go. The passive DI box does not require any power. It's simply transforming high impedance to low impedance without needing any extra output. So for shorter cable runs, home studios, things like that, a lot of passive DI boxes are very popular, and they're also quite a bit cheaper than active DI boxes. With our speaker cable, now we're sending down potentially hundreds of watts of power. So we don't want a shield. We have this powerful signal that's coming down that can overcome any kind of inherent noise that the cable might pick up. So we have a positive, negative, no shield at all. So we have just big hunks of copper with a positive and negative. With our naming system, the higher the number, the smaller the gauge. So you can see 14 gauge wire, very thin, or 2 gauge wire, very thick. So there's an inverse relationship there. So smaller the wire, the more resistance, smaller the gauge, thicker the wire. Also in cables, we're dealing with snakes, right? So we want to lay a neat stage instead of having 48 or 50, 24, 50-foot microphone cables, or how do we get cables from the stage to the mixer way in the back of the bar? We can use an audio snake. So we have all the cable coiled up here neatly, and we can install that. This is called the fan out. So we'll have an area where we can plug this into the mixer or our A to D converters or wherever we need to plug them in. And then we have our stage box that we would use to plug things from the stage. We would call this a 20x4. So that means there's 20 XLRs and 4 returns. So we could use things for monitors or headphones or in-ear monitors. In this case, we have a 12x4, and you can see this is all XLR. It's kind of a grady picture, but these are all XLR returns. But with the XLR cable, the pins tell you where the audio is going. So we would be plugging the pins in. That means the audio is going down, and the pins are coming out of this. Means the audio is coming back, again, to return to stage monitors or inner monitors or headphones, things like that. So we'd call this a 12x4. And there's also variations on that called a subsnake. So we could use a subsnake, for instance, to run between a regular snake and the drums. So instead of 25 or 50-foot cables for the drum mics, we could use just 10-foot cables, put this stage box right by the kick drum, and run all the cables to this, run this one cable across the stage, and then plug our fan out into a snake. Pretty easily done. We also have something called a splitter snake, and you can see what happens. Each input you plug in gives 2 discrete outputs. So we could use this to run one to the front of house console, one to the monitor console. We could use this to run to the PA and run this to a recording feed. So for something like the Academy Awards where, 1 million people are watching it, there would be this for the TV feed, and then there are people who are in the theater. This would be people for in the theater. And that's everything about cables.